everyone. I am Kinsey, and I did my paper on the Civil War in North Carolina and Stoneman's Raid in Salisbury. I live in Salisbury, North Carolina, and so I thought it would be interesting to do my own area because I don't know that much about it. So basically, obviously the Civil War is the war between the North and the South, the war to end slavery. There's all kinds of names for it. And in about 1864 to 1865, the war had moved into North Carolina. And while not many of the notable battles were fought in North Carolina, a lot of people don't realize that North Carolina still played a very important role. The war was known for putting North Carolinian versus North Carolinian, so brother against brother for fighting. Some were fighting for the Union, some were fighting for the Confederacy, so it was definitely a mix and one versus the other kind of thing. There are actually along the coast of North Carolina, there is Fort Macon and Fort Fisher. Both of these were used during the time of the Civil War. And by 1865, the supply line through Wilmington was the last remaining supply route open to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And that was from NorthCarolinaHistorySites.org. And that is still very true because the forts that they're still there today and they're historic sites, so you can go and see them. And they provided a access to help the Civil War and to get supplies for the Civil War. Fort Fisher was able to keep the port in Wilmington open to supplies that were brought inward. The next thing that I talked about was Salisbury, which is my area of North Carolina. Salisbury housed a Confederate prison in North Carolina during the war, and it was actually pretty gruesome. I read some stories about it in my research, and it was pretty gruesome what happened. There's a lot of testimonials about it as well. Actually, one of the Salisbury residents during the time, Dr. Josephus Wells Hall, he was a surgeon during the Civil War, and his house now is actually a museum, and you can go and walk in it, and you can see his documents from the Civil War. It's really cool. And actually, he had to get a pardon after the war was over from Andrew Johnson for his service to the Confederacy, to the Confederate Medical Corps. And then the main thing that I want to talk about is Stoneman's Raid. General George Stoneman was a leader for the Union Army, and he was actually told to dismantle the country, and that's exactly what he did in his raids of early 1865. In April of 1865, he had set out to destroy Salisbury, which was actually one of the 5th largest cities in North Carolina at the time. For Stoneman's cavalrymen, the Rowan County town was particularly attracted because of the large federal prison that was located there. Like I mentioned, the federal prison was a big deal then. And that was from one of the books I use on page 356. And what Stoneman was planning to do as he came from Mocksville into Salisbury, he was planning on destroying the railroad that ran across the Yadkin River Bridge, and he was trying to stop the supplies that were coming in from Salisbury. And he led his men from Mocksville, which is 17 miles north of Salisbury, and like I said, it was an attempt to destroy the town. So what Stoneman was not expecting was 1,000 Confederate soldiers defending the bridge on top of York Hill, which is right there at the Yadkin River Bridge. And these men were ready to defend Salisbury, and the Union forces were forced to pull back into Salisbury. The bridge was left intact and unharmed, and the Union forces were retreated back into Salisbury. And then they began to ransack the town, going through burning, pillaging, that kind of thing, and throwing the contents of the things in the stores outside in the streets for the whites and the Negroes to get things, and anything that was left was burned. And finally, the aftermath of the Civil War obviously was a big one. The aftermath took, it was 1866 to 1877, so that's about 11 years, and there was a big organization time, and it was also a big time to reconstruct. During this Reconstruction period, many of the blacks still fell into the hands, because obviously, talked about Civil War, it's about states' rights and slavery and that kind of thing, and the blacks, obviously, during this time period of Reconstruction, they fell still into the hands of the white majority. The blacks did. And one of the quotes I found was actually, while the North won the war, in the end the South gained the peace. So even though things didn't work out, the South ultimately gained the peace because of slavery. They didn't have slavery anymore. And one of the things that I want to end with is that North Carolina, even though it didn't play a very important role as far as the Civil War, North Carolina played an important but frequently overlooked role in the grand strategy of the Civil War, because of the forts that kept kept things out and people safe inside North Carolina, if you want to put it that way. And it actually helped the war because of that. The forts on the coast, like I said, everything else, just with the war, the South ultimately gained the peace. So that was my paper, and I hope you enjoyed it.